Hello, I'm Lane Hartzell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with eco-philosopher Derek Jensen. Hi, Derek. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Good to see you again for Techniques and Civilization.
Nice to see you
And
too.
this segment is on ultra-urbanization and what we call half-Earth. So I wanted to open up with a segment or a part of the book called Half-Earth by E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, good biologist, and he did work on ants. And that's really interesting work. I wish we had time to talk about that. But let me just quote from him talking about what's going on right now. And he's writing, this has been about 7 years ago, I guess it was. So let me start with this. E.O. Wilson writes, "We thrash about appallingly led with no particular goal in mind other than economic growth, unfettered consumption, good health, and personal happiness. The impact on the rest of the biosphere is everywhere negative, the environment becoming unsustainable, unstable, and less pleasant, over long-term future less certain." And then he goes on to offer this idea of half Earth, which is to move the Earth's population of human beings into urban centers and then letting nature restore the planet. So the principle is restoration, regeneration. And then one of the great science fiction writers, Kim Stanley Robinson, wrote in an op-ed, "People tend to like cities and have been congregating in them ever since the invention of agriculture 10,000 years or so ago. That's why we call it civilization." He goes on, "Cities emerge from the confusion of possibilities as beacons of hope. If we managed urbanization properly, we could nearly remove ourselves from a considerable percentage of the Earth's planet, of the planet's surface, sorry. What would be good for many of the threatened species we share with this planet with, which in turn would be good for us because we are completely enmeshed in Earth's web of life. Stanley says we ought to do this because people are leaving the land and moving to cities anyway." So your initial response to this emergency, what do you think?
Well, my response to the emergency is that it's absolutely correct that um, the ecological infrastructure of the planet is being destroyed. Or we could talk about natural communities being destroyed if you don't want to use machine language. That the Earth's being killed. The oceans are being. There are stolid scientists who are talking about how the oceans could be devoid of fish in another, what, 28 years now? They're talking about 2050. And they've been saying this for 10, 15 years, at least. And, global warming is catastrophic, but, I don't even think global warming is the worst of the problems. I mean, biodiversity crash is everywhere. I was just talking with a friend last night who said that even 3 or 4 years ago, she used to see, a half dozen pairs of meadowlarks. And this year she sees one meadowlark male all by himself. And she used to see bunches of robins. And robins, I never use this term, but there are some birders who use the term trash birds to describe robins because there used to be so many of them. And so like a birder, it gets all excited at a more rare bird. So it'd be it's just a trash bird. And now robins are rare. I saw a robin yesterday and I don't see very many. And no matter what metric you use, the health of the planet is going down. And so I agree with that part. I also agree that I love the E.O. Wilson quote that you were saying. "We thrash about appallingly led with no particular goal in mind other than economic growth, unfettered consumption, good health, and personal happiness." I'm not even sure that good health and personal happiness really are central to it. So it's good that he put unfettered growth as first because that's what's most important to those in power and to the majority, the whatever the percentage of people who have certainly bought into the system, then it's true for them too. And it's very interesting also because individually, almost nobody wants growth. Nobody wants for there to be more houses go into their community or to almost everybody I know, if you go back to where you were born or you go back to where you grew up, it breaks your heart, because what used to be a wild place became farms, and then from farms became cities. And and this is happening so quickly. My mother's grandmother, so my great grandmother, when she was a little girl on the plains of Nebraska, she would get scared because she was afraid that lightning and thunder would spook the buffalo and cause the buffalo to stampede and run over their house, their sod house in the prairie. I was like, who worries about getting run over by buffalo at this point in at least the Great Plains? And this is just 3 generations. That's a blink of an evolutionary eye. So yeah, I agree with all that. A couple places I disagree with it. I also agree that as many places as possible should be protected from humans behaving badly. And we can talk about what that means, whether it's industrialization or whether it is I just read a thing. Oh, you actually sent me a thing just today about how rhino poaching has gone up this year.
Yesterday.
So it doesn't matter to me which humans are acting badly. I mean, it does matter, but also nature needs places where humans don't act badly. And we can talk about why and how people act badly also. So I agree with those parts. Parts that I disagree with would be, first, that I'm going to read your quote. People tend to like cities and have been congregating in them since the invention of agriculture. So that's not really true. People have tended to move to cities either for work or because their land has been enclosed. And until recently, with increases in modern sanitation, cities where population sinks. Because London, for example, I mean, the numbers are pretty astounding, and I'm kind of making up the numbers, so don't quote me, but I'm not off by a factor of 3. I could be off by a factor of 2. That your average lifespan of a poor person who went into London was like 18 months because of illness. It was a very short lifespan, and cities were, for the most part, population sinks. And so that's one place I disagree with. People have not traditionally wanted to move to cities. People have moved to cities when their land has been enclosed, or land has been stolen. I can think of very few traditional indigenous people who have completely given up their way of living without having land base stolen from them. Sure, they have changed their lives when guns were introduced, when alcohol was introduced, when metal pots were introduced, and that's a discussion we can have, but they didn't voluntarily say, hey, gosh, wouldn't it be so much better to move to a city and get a job than it is to, live out here in the country. So I don't agree with that. And the same is true. I was talking to Vandana Shiva a few years ago about would the people of Mumbai, in the poorer parts of Mumbai, would they be better off if the global economy disappeared tomorrow? And she laughed and she said, the reason that they're in the poor parts of Mumbai is because their land has been taken. I mean, they didn't move there voluntarily. Nobody wants to live there. And without the sort of, another example of this is, I knew a woman whose ex-husband was from Bangladesh, and he is our age, basically. And when he was younger, when he was a teenager, his mother would say to him, go down to the river and catch us some lunch. And he would go catch a fish and bring it home for lunch. But then by the time he was in his early 30s, the river was so polluted that the fish were dead, and they had to buy their fish from Iceland. And so that in many ways, is the history of civilization, moving from people being self-sufficient, not being in a wage economy, and then having their land somehow or another destroyed, and then them having to move to cities to get jobs because you got to live. So that's one place I disagree. The other place I disagree is, I want to look at it again to remember the place I disagreed. Oh, the other place I disagree is that that people being in cities is actually more sustainable than people living in rural areas anyway. The reason that seems the case is because they get everything they have from a long ways away. And their actual carbon footprint of somebody living in London or Paris or New York City or Beijing is much higher than someone living, especially a subsistence farmer living in rural Thailand. That, but we don't. And even when it comes to, I saw this a few years ago, and we put it in our book, Bright Green Lies, that it ends up that your amount of fuel used for travel is not dependent on whether you live in a city or whether you live in the country. It's actually primarily dependent on your income. And richer people spend more money on fuel for transportation than do poor people. Even in a country like Holland, which is known for having boatloads of bikes, city people use just as much fuel as country people. Again, the primary differential is income. So and we can talk about this on every level, that every city. I was just talking with a friend today about a relative of hers who lives in a poor part of Newark, New Jersey. And as a side note, she just said, she's saying my cousin who lives in a poor part of Newark, which is a hellscape. And when she said that, I thought the same thing I think when people talk about any sprawling city, which is not that long ago, this was meadows and forests. And the quote by Kim Stanley Robinson is correct, that we call it civilization because people live in cities. It comes from the root. So civilization comes from the root civitatis, which means state or city. But the problem is that no city will ever be sustainable, because a city, when I was writing Endgame, I tried to define what a civilization is. And like I said, it's a way of life characterized by the growth of cities, which is defensible both linguistically and historically. But then that's fine, Derek, but what's a city? And a city I define, and this is defensible, a city I define as people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources. That differentiates it from a village, which can be self-sustained. The problem is that once you remove that, once you make the damage far away, then it invisibilizes, to use that sort of postmodern term, it invisibilizes the damage, and suddenly you don't really care if you're getting your hardwood from South America and your softwood from Southeast United States. It's like we don't pay attention to where stuff comes from and where our poop goes. And by poop, I mean our literal poop. I mean, the poop in New York City is, and waste in general, but there is so much feces produced in New York City. They used to take it out and dump it in the ocean, and now they put it in trains and take it down to Alabama. And people in that community where they now transport it, they can no longer go out on their porches because it smells so bad.
Are they composting this, or what do they do?
I have no idea what they do with it, except I know it stinks. And it's the local people. It brings in money, but I mean, there's going to be, if you've got 8 million people, that's going to be, if we wanted to take a time, we could do the math on how much poop that is every day. And that's just poop. That's not including styrofoam. That's not including metal waste. That's not including wood waste. That's not including brick, food waste. So here's the thing is I know some people who have done some studies. I haven't done these studies myself, but I know some people who have done studies on how much, well, the point is that just a few grocery stores will produce hundreds of pounds of food waste every week. I'm sorry, of meat waste. That's not even including the produce, bakery, canned goods, anything else. It's just hundreds of pounds of meat waste. And the point here is not whether people do or don't eat meat. The point is that that's just that's not even the food they consume. That's just the food. And that doesn't even include the packaging. So the point is that what do you do with all your waste? That doesn't, the whole, again, I'm all for protecting as much of the earth as we can, but urbanization doesn't particularly help. That's all I'm saying.
Right. I think what E.O. Wilson, the principle there is regeneration. I think that that's agreeable. And from what I hear you saying, what I see in your writings is that, well, that's fine, the principle, but the actual practice of urbanization is going to be a major problem. Of course, I reference you, and then I've given a number of talks in this direction. So let's go with this thing with, cities are population sinks. People are pretty much forced economically, or sometimes because their military takes their land, or maybe Nigeria, we've talked about this. If we have, okay, say right now about 54%, 55% of the world's population are already in urban centers. Let's say, for example, we get that up to 40%. I'm not talking about what you have to do to get people there, which would probably kill maybe half of them. But let's say you could do 40% of people getting to the urban centers. This process you're talking about of not only externalization of, let's say, extraction, minerals, concrete, sand, all of this kind of stuff has to be taken into the city, food. But you're also saying that the cities are producing all of this waste, all kinds of stuff, toxic chemicals, pollution. So regeneration would not come about with Half-Earth. Would that be logical?
Well, it's difficult because I don't want to part of the difficulty is that in the past 30 years, and especially in the past 20 years and 15 years, the idea of setting aside land for non-humans has come increasingly under fire, especially from the left. And I'm seeing demands a lot that national parks have their protection removed, that national parks are racist, that they are classist. And I know a lot of people are going to hate me for this, but my loyalty, given what is happening to non-humans, my loyalty is to endangered non-humans. And so they need homes too. They need habitat. They need places where, like I said, humans aren't behaving badly. And so I am delighted at the notion that a significant portion of the earth should be protected, again, from humans behaving badly. And at the same time, I think what really needs to enter this conversation is contraction, that we need to recognize that humans are in overshoot, and we can rearrange our living arrangements all we want, and that's not going to alter the fact that humans are in overshoot. And when you're in overshoot, you're permanently reducing the carrying capacity. And every cell in my body wants for us to have a voluntary transformation, wants for us to voluntarily reduce population. I don't believe that's going to happen. And voluntary reduced population and consumption, to be really clear, the population and consumption are both problems. And it's really important to include the consumption because honestly, when people mention population, usually what they mean is what they picture is a little brown baby in Mexico City. And the truth is that that little brown baby in Mexico City is not doing as much harm as anybody in New York City or Tokyo, or doesn't matter what their race is, but any wealthy person is doing far more harm. So consumption is important, but here's the thing, is it is also fashionable on the left to say that when you talk about overconsumption, then that somehow means that there aren't too many humans. But it's both. It's a both and problem. And also when you say that there's too many humans, people will say, gosh, they immediately jump to, you want to introduce some sort of draconian measures to, it's like you kill yourself first. But the important thing, the really important thing is to recognize that the single most important thing you can do to reduce population growth is teach girls to read. Because if young females have even that amount of privilege, or not privilege, but even that amount of independence, what study after study has shown is that reduces the number of children that they have. So what we really need to do is to liberate women, and giving women absolute reproductive freedom decreases the number. And that's not draconian. All that means is you have to take on patriarchy and the capitalist growth imperative. Because here's another problem with talking about population, is that when we talk about population, it's like, oh my God, there's too many people in Africa. But when they talk about Japan or Russia having a declining birth rate, then they freak out and say, oh, we need to have sex holidays where everybody goes home from work and has sex so we can have more babies.
Government sponsored.
Government sponsored. So
Mm-hmm.
that lets us know the sort of race. I'm not saying that it's not race and classist the way they talk about population, but the fact that the way policymakers talk about it doesn't mean that there aren't too many people. So my point is that to have a discussion about sustainability, whatever that means, we also have to discuss declining consumption and declining population. We cannot continue to have, what is GNP? What GNP really is a measure of how quickly the planet is converted from the living to the dead. Because if you have a school of fish swimming through the ocean, and they don't actually count for GNP, but as soon as those fish are caught, turned into fish sticks and sold, they count for GNP. You have a living forest, it doesn't count for GNP. You cut that forest down, turn it into 2x4s, suddenly it counts for GNP. So years and years ago, I was sharing the stage with Ward Churchill, and we're talking beforehand, just chatting backstage, and we're talking about the Holocaust, the German Holocaust of the Jews and other people in Europe. And I said, I can't believe how stupid the Germans were to keep such careful, meticulous records of their atrocities, like keeping track of the number of gold teeth and then bales of hair and the numbers that they killed. It's like, if you're going to commit an atrocity, don't keep such good records. That's just, and he looked at me and he said, Derek, what do you think GNP is? GNP is just a measure of the ecological atrocities.
Whoa.
And so one more thing, and then I'll shut up, which is just that.
No, that's a good point. Come back to it.
My whole point with this is, whether we urbanize or not, if we don't get economic growth under control and don't actually start to withdraw and allow the planet to recover, then we're just, to use a cliche, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's whether you urbanize or not, I mean, nature needs a relief, and we're taking more and more of the primary production of the planet every year than we took the year before. So of course the planet's falling apart. And it doesn't matter how you rearrange us in that context. I mean, yes, it matters a little bit. That's why we need to protect some places anyway. But the big question is, how do we scale down? And how do we scale down in a way? Because here's the problem, is that if we don't do it, the natural world's going to do it. And I guarantee that if the natural world does it, we're not going to like how it turns out. I would, some people say, gosh, Derek, you must hate humans. Not at all. I'm not the one who is creating a hellscape for the future. I'm the one who really wants, all of my work can be condensed to this way of living won't last. And when it's over, I would prefer there's more of the world left rather than less. And
Right.
humans who come after are going to thank any of us who fight for any part of the living earth right now. Either that or they're going to hate us all for what we've done to the planet. Years and years ago, this is 30 years ago now. It is 30 years ago, 1992. I was at a debate between two people running for the office of Department of Natural Resources for the state of Washington. And I asked a question. I said, pretend we're children living 40 years from now and convince us not to hate you for what you've done to the natural world.
Mhm.
And the audience gasped, and both of the people running for head of Washington Department of Natural Resources got really mad and didn't answer the question. But I think it's the most important question there is. That's the question is, what can we do now to make it so those in the future don't hate us? And I think one of the things we have to grapple with is that how do we scale down? I want to tell one more story and then I promise I'll shut up, which is when I was a kid, I was messy, as I still am. And my mom would sometimes say, clean your room. And I wouldn't do it. And she would say, clean your room. And I wouldn't do it. She'd say, clean your room. And I wouldn't do it. And then finally she would say, look, you're going to clean your room by dinner time. And if you don't do it, I'm going to do it. And if I do it, you're not going to like it because I'm going to throw everything away. And
You told me that before.
that's what we're facing with the planet is, if I were the leader of the entire economy, I wouldn't deindustrialize tomorrow. What I would do is I would get rid of the obvious things first, like golf courses or retractable stadium roofs. So, we can all choose our luxuries that are completely unnecessary. Raising alfalfa in the desert, stupid idea. And I would get rid of those things first, and then I would, you cut the easy things, and then you cut the things that are more difficult and more difficult.
Right.
And here's the problem is that, like, people always say, anti-environmentalists used to say this, and now environmentalists are saying it too. Gosh, we need to make some compromises. The problem is that the compromises always come from the earth and they never come from the economy. What is never negotiable is that we have to have economic growth. That's never negotiable. And that's what I'm saying has to be on the table. So I don't actually care. We can urbanize, not urbanize, but the important thing is we need to withdraw.
Okay, well, I thought about this and I thought, well, how could this even be done? Assuming you could move, the other 40 or 50% of people into city. I mean, to get them there, well, you've got war and probably half would die. But anyway, let's say you could do it. And I thought about this, what kind of technological, if I would put on my sci-fi hat.
One more thing is that
Yeah.
the other thing, what this means is when they move to cities, that means they're dependent upon the corporations they work for, because those people who are going to be moved off their land onto cities are going to be people who are probably subsistence farmers, hunter-gatherers, are going to be small scale people who are not actually they're either doing not much harm or doing no harm at all. And so that's the point, is that they're not participating in the economic system. This is actually the entire history of civilization right here is manifested in what you just said, which is a history of moving people off their land, enclosing them, and forcing them into the economic system, forcing them into the wage economy. That's why the laws of apartheid were written, because you had all these subsistence farmers and they had mines and they couldn't get anybody to work in the mines. So what do? They put in hut taxes, poll taxes, dog taxes, all so they could force people into the monetary economy, because a subsistence farmer does not have the money to pay their annual hut tax. And so somebody's got to go to work. And that's been the whole point, is to incorporate people, because besides which, if people are living in, that guy I mentioned from Bangladesh, he didn't have to pay anything to go fishing. And now they have to pay money to a transnational corporation. It's the same. You move all these people to the city, they're all going to be completely dependent on this system. And it's madness. Daniel Quinn had this great line about how the fundamental problem is that we have made ourselves dependent for our very lives on a system that is destroying the planet. And moving all those people to the city makes them all dependent on the system that is destroying the planet. That doesn't help. Sorry, I kept interrupting you. Go ahead.
You're right. Well, I try to think all of that is great commentary. And I don't want to talk too much because I want you to be able to lay out the explanations. But I did think about this, and I told you this before, probably in email, that if the only way that you could do this kind of thing is you're going to have more technology, which we don't have right now. But let's say we did. Now we magically can move all of these people into the city without hurting anyone, without destroying the earth. And then once we get them to the city, then we would have to have like desktop manufacturing. Like, in the past, it was desktop publishing where eventually you had a computer on your desk. Now they're talking about, the possibility of desktop manufacturing, which I think is possible, but quite far in the future. You would have to have a nano printer that can assemble using atoms material things right there at that desktop, right? And you'd have to have von Neumann replicators that could replicate different parts automatically. So nano printing and nanotechnology we'd have to understand van der Waals forces and all of this kind of stuff for that to even be possible. Then you have to package it and get it out and have this in the city. And then you also would have to have the replicators that can make this stuff, machines that can make machines. That we don't have anything like that. I mean, that's total sci-fi what I'm talking about. But let's say we did have that, we wouldn't need the city. So that's why I say, I mean, somebody in the village with a desktop manufacturing module wouldn't need to be moving to the city anyway and could live sustainably. So I think that this idea hasn't been thought out, but it's been, people have written lots about the information of half Earth. That's what I think.
And I just go back to the same question. Where are they going to get the materials? Where are they going to where does the food come from for the city? Where does all the stuff go? I mean, there has never been a sustainable city in the history of cities. Not one, ever. And, we keep, excuse me, we keep pretending that we are sentient. And, what sample size do you need of cities not being sustainable before you'll finally recognize, and how many cities have there ever been? Let's say 20,000 cities over 100,000 people. I don't know how many there have been, but none of them has ever been sustainable. They all require a countryside from which they steal. And have we had the conversation about the conversation I had with the Marxist about he was going to have a purely
Bus? Yeah.
The bus thing.
Yep.
And the short version of that is there's a guy who said we could live sustainably in cities. And I said, how do you get transportation? And he said a bus. And long story short, that to get a bus, you have to have metals, which means you have to have mines. Every hard rock mine that has ever happened has polluted groundwater, which means you've got to kick the people off their land. You've got to pollute the river. And the people who live next to the river got to kick them off their land. It's like, you can't, you're absolutely right when you say this is science fiction. I mean, that's what it is. And there has never been a sustainable city. And here's another thing is that I just recently released a very short video on my responses to COVID. And the important thing here is that one of the things I said is that I can't believe that there haven't actually been a lot more pandemics, because the way we packed into cities are basically factory farms for humans. And you can't, if you were a virus or bacteria and you wanted to create a system you wanted to create a food system for yourself where
Perfect.
you wanted to have high transmissibility, you couldn't create a better system than packing people tight into cities, because then they'll come into contact and pass the disease, and then lots of rapid transportation. So one city gets it, goes to the next city, goes to the next city. You couldn't design a better system than that. So he wants to put more people in cities. It's like, hello, more pandemics. I don't, it doesn't make sense to me on so many levels. Again, I applaud the notion of, and I adore the notion of setting aside land and water for non-human species. That is absolutely necessary. And traditional indigenous people have had that throughout most of history, or through most prehistory, that most places were either very sparsely settled, or there would be large spaces that were fairly devoid of humans, because humans would live in a community, and then there would be places where it's taboo to go, sort of sacred places.
Yes.
Where you only go once a year.
Can I say something? Let me interrupt you.
Please.
It's not like that they were, this kind of Hobbesian world that's been created that's not the natural trajectory of civilization. I mean, that is the natural trajectory of civilization, but not for humans. As you said, humans actually chose not to form these large centers. At a lot of the time when you're talking about there, they would have taboos. They knew that you couldn't have these large areas, right? It was dangerous.
Well, there's that. And also, this is, okay, I'm really comfortable with everything I've said so far. And I'm going to say this too, but people might even more disagree with this than other things. But I think humans, and I think this is true for a lot of non-humans too, are fundamentally contentious. I don't think we're awful, but we've all talked about Dunbar's number, where you've got like 120 people is the largest, or 150 people is the largest community you can have, where you still have sort of direct governance. That if it gets beyond that, you can't have direct relationships with everybody. Our minds just can't keep all those relationships together. You start having representative governments, etc. But the point is that I think that we have little disputes and spats. And, I've talked to so many indigenous people about this too. They say, look, we're just like white people. We're just like everybody else in the world, that we get mad at each other, And a friend of mine, Jeanette Armstrong, said, look, the difference is, I know that my great-grandchild might marry your great-grandchild. So we have to figure out ways to get along, because we're going to be living in the same place for 500 years.